Here's a question from Molly Stevens. How should one respond to an assertion that Christianity is patriarchal, and if only there was a goddess to worship, she might consider it?
Oh, the reason I'm chuckling is because this person is not going to be pleased with the answer. I don't mean Molly. I mean the person. Well, if only God were this way, the way I like it, the way I want it, then I could go with it. Okay? It doesn't matter how a person wants reality to be. What matters is what reality is. Okay? Now, there may be some value in clarifying the patriarchal element. God identifies himself as a father. Now, he's not a man. And it's clear when you look in passages describing God that he has kind of characteristics that classically can be identified as male and female. Now, nowadays it's even dangerous to make that statement because that implies that men and women are kind of different, and a lot of people don't even like that. But for those of you who can see the world as it actually is, which is most of you, men and women are different. No duh. And vive la différence. I mean, that's a good thing. It also creates difficulties. Whatever, given that God identifies himself as a father, that's his word for himself, even though he's a warrior God. That's pretty obvious. And he's like a hen who gathers chicks under his wings and spreads his wings for protection. That's in the Psalm somewhere, maybe 90, 91, something like that. So there are ways that the God is described that entail both classical male and classical female characteristics. And in fact, some have argued that the image of God in man, that is in humans, is properly expressed in both male and female understood together, okay? Because God's characteristics of God's personality, so to speak, are captured uniquely in each of the genders or the sexes. So when the God is a father, oh, that's patriarchal, but he's not a man. However, there's no question that the system that God set up, and this is controversial with some people, but I honestly do not see scripturally why this is so. Culturally, yes. Scripturally, no. The world that God set up and the way things are in the Bible is a patriarchy. There are fathers who have wives and give birth to children and who have sons, and the father is the head of the household. And this is not just some accident of ancient history, and we know better now. It's also repeated in the New Testament. Now, there are patterns of submission that we see in the New Testament, but there's no question that there is a hierarchy of role, not value, in the New Testament. So that could be pejoratively characterized as patriarchy. But I don't know. Here, it stands to reason we got lots of wonderful workers, and then we have an executive staff that makes decisions, and then we have one guy at the top of it that the buck stops with him, and that's me. And most of the time, everybody does their job fine. Other times, we got to get together and talk about things, and sometimes we count the votes, and sometimes we weigh the votes. And my vote has the most weight. But that doesn't create a problem here. That is the only way an organization can be run. And it's the only way a family could be run. You can't, it's not a democracy. You don't say, okay, mom decides one thing, dad wants something else, so the kids break the tie. It's not the way it works. There is a head, and the head has the responsibility. So I am unabashedly I unabashedly affirm the patriarchal elements as I've described it and qualified them in the Bible, and that God is a father. That is the way he's chosen to describe himself. Now, my take is that's the way the world actually is. Can, on a human side, those things be abused? Absolutely. Anybody can abuse any system because human beings are fallen. Just because it can be abused doesn't mean that it's not a good plan, or it's not the plan that God's established. So when it comes to somebody who says, "Gee, if God were a woman, I'd feel more comfortable," my response is, God's not a woman. I'm sorry. So that's God. He's not a man either, but he's characterized as a father, and he's created and he's established an order in certain organization enterprises like family or work or government. And that order, there's a hierarchy, and that's the way it is. Now, if you don't like that, I don't like it all the time either. It doesn't change what's actually so. Incidentally, on a personal note, there's a little parallel here. I'm supposed to be in love with Jesus. Jesus is a guy. I think it's a lot easier for women to be in love with Jesus than it is for men to be in love with Jesus. You know, but I can't change that. I wish Jesus was a really beautiful woman, and then I could really connect with snuggling up with him and holding him and him holding me. And
okay, wait, hold on
great?
a second. Hold on a second, because I think you're called to love him. I think in love is a different thing.
I know, but all I'm saying, I'm not trying to over-sensualize this. I'm joking a little bit hyperbolically here, but the point I'm making is, it is more difficult. Because my experience of emotional love is much more powerful towards a woman than it is towards men. I have men I love; they're on our team, but it's not. It's just not the same. All I'm saying is, we have a male Messiah. Okay, the Son of God is incarnated in a male. Okay, and that creates, and I don't think I'm alone, some liabilities for connecting emotionally with him. All right? Maybe some don't have it, whatever. But I can't change the fact that Jesus is a male human being. The Son of God is a male human being. That's reality. And so I got to work within my own, discomforts about that and try to forge a relationship that's meaningful. I'm just saying that's a little stumbling block. But so just like God being a father might be a stumbling block for this other gal. There's many virtues in it. And so the big thing is, the reality is what it is.
Yes. So along those lines, Greg, I have a point about what I think is going on behind this, and then I have a couple points about how you might proceed if you're talking to someone who's making this claim. First, I think there are two cultural ideas that are lurking behind this statement, and one you've already mentioned, Greg, and that is the view of religion that we have is that it's whatever we like. We should just choose something we like, and whatever we believe. It doesn't matter what we believe. It only matters that we're sincere. There's not this understanding that there is a spiritual reality that we're supposed to conform ourselves to. Right. That's a completely foreign idea to most of our culture.
Right.
So already from this question, we can see this is her view of religion. You know, if it weren't patriarchal, then if it were a goddess, then I would consider it. You can tell she's not thinking in terms of reality. She's not thinking in terms of truth. That's just completely outside of her understanding. So there's your first entry point if you're talking to someone about this, where you could say, okay, so why does what you like make a difference? Is that your understanding of how religion works? So there's a way in where you can start planning the idea that we are making a claim about reality, not a claim about what we like or a claim about what makes us feel good or whatever it is.
It's actually how the book The Story of Reality starts, by saying that Christianity is a picture of reality. Where we mean to describe the way the world actually is, not the way people want to make it out to be. And it's the second that is the trend, not the first, when it comes to religion.
So that's the first cultural idea I think is behind this. The second one I think is behind this is the idea of identity being all important. I think what she has in mind here is that a man can't represent me. What do I have to do with a man? I need a woman to be the person I worship, or at least the feminine to be what I worship, because I am a woman, and that's what's important to me. So there's this kind of being collapsed into a category of your identity and your group that you can't get out of.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be something you can say there in terms of interacting with men, and why does she feel like this is the case? I don't have as many ideas for that one, but I think this idea of identity is definitely part of this.
That's a great insight, and both of these kind of reflect the current ethos. It's the way people think nowadays. I think Natasha Crane's book, for example, Faithfully Different, and she talks about the feelings are driving things. Happiness is what really matters. And of course we see these kind of identity categories that are part of culture that justify people pursuing, which is often destructive behavior, because they take this as authentically reflecting, quote unquote, who they really are. Mm-hmm. And so this is part of the problem we're running into here.
So now I have a couple ideas of more questions you can ask. And the first one to ask is, what do you mean by patriarchal? What do you mean by that?
Good. Where'd you get that question?
Because what does she mean by that? Christianity is patriarchal. Well, my guess is she's going to have some ideas that are not Christianity. So here's an example where here's an approach you can take where you can actually correct maybe some ideas that she has of Christianity. Now, it could be that some of what she means by patriarchal is the idea that there are standards that we don't get to make up, that you have to conform yourself to.
There's an authority, in other words.
There's an authority. And this is something I think is not as native an idea to women, because women tend to want to make people feel good and be peacemakers and all those sorts of things and adjust standards in order to make other people feel better, to nurture them, whereas men tend to uphold the standards. So maybe that's part of what she's thinking about here. And that is true. That is part of Christianity. There's a reality and there's a standard that we conform ourselves to. And that might be what she's reacting against. But you don't know what she's reacting against until she tells you, because patriarchy is a word that's used to mean all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And then finally, and I think this might be the most important thing to do, as you're asking her about patriarchy, I think it's important to explain just what Christianity teaches about men and women. And it's in a very simple way, and that is this. Christ is the model for how men are to treat women and their wives in particular. And this is specifically in the Bible, where the idea that the man is supposed to love his wife as Christ loved the church. And that's in Ephesians, right?
Ephesians 5. Wait. You should have this memorized. I know where that is.
So this is something you can bring to her attention and say, you might not realize this, but the whole idea of Christianity is that the person in power came and died to serve the person he was over. Mm-hmm. So even if
responsible for.
Yes, responsible for. So even if you're talking about...
And by the way, just to interrupt, that's a whole big part of it. It isn't just being over. It is taking responsibility for and caring for, in the same passage, loving the man, loving the woman the way he loves his own body. And he cares for his own body. He's got to care for his wife as well.
So these are all things to point out because, Jesus makes the whole point. The Gentiles, they lord it over the people. Mm-hmm. They're over. And so that's the view of power many non-Christians have. So when you're talking about, say, the husband having the power or the Father God having the power, what people hear is, oh, he's lording it over them. But that is the opposite of what Jesus said. So here's an opportunity for you to say, hey, do you know what Jesus had to say about power?
Mm-hmm.
This is what he had to say. He washed his disciples' feet. The text actually says, knowing that he came from God and was going back to God, he washed their feet.
Right.
That means as an expression of his power was service. And of course, the cross is the biggest example of that. The person in power is the person who served. The greatest among you is the one who serves. The husband is supposed to love his wife the way Christ loved the church. And how did he love the church? He died for her to save her.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of power, this is such a radical idea. And this really affected the way in the entire West views a lot of things.
Right.
But some people don't hear that when they hear there's a Father God. So here's an example for you to say, hey, let me just tell you about what Jesus did on the cross, because I think this might change your view of what I mean when I say there's a Father God.
Let me add a qualifier just so there's no misunderstanding. This is not an abrogation of power. It is a proper way that power is to be used. Jesus washed the disciples' feet, but he was still the Lord. He was still, in a certain sense, over them. Now, husbands are responsible for wives, but the way and to care for them, but the way they're responsible in caring for them is serving them by leading them. So it's going to be the case that a loving husband isn't one that just does whatever his wife or children want them to do, and that's servanthood. He has to decide before the Lord and the circumstances what is the the best, healthiest, and appropriate way, to love his wife and his children. So there is this kind of interesting, and actually for men, very challenging balance. How do you lead? And that is be the head. The buck stops there. The husband has veto power, but to exercise in a way that it's not just raw power and autocracy, but it's this power and position of responsibility and authority that is being used in a gracious, loving way, the way Jesus was Lord and still was willing to lay his life down for his disciples and for us. That makes sense?
Yeah, so there are two ideas for you, Molly. Number one, help her to understand that the claim we're making is one of truth and reality, and that we have an obligation to conform ourselves to truth and to believe the truth, just like we would have an obligation in the world around us to recognize the truth, because the truth will get us in some way if we ignore it. And then secondly, to talk about who Christ is and what he did on the cross and how that is the central aspect of Christianity, not some idea of an angry, punishing judge. That's not at the center of Christianity. Yes, God is a judge. That is true, but that's not the center of Christianity.
And also he judges, when he does, he judges justly and righteously.